I had been cleaning out my old photography equipment, and among the items I was parting with was a vintage camera. It was a classic piece, still functional, but I knew it was time to let it go. I decided to list it on Facebook Marketplace, hoping to find it a new home where it would be appreciated. Not long after posting the camera, I received a message from a potential buyer named Mark. He was interested and wanted to negotiate a price. I didn't mind negotiating. After all, I understood that everyone was looking for a good deal. We exchanged messages, and Mark seemed reasonable at first. We agreed upon a price that was lower than my initial listing, but still fair for the camera's value. We set up a meeting at a local coffee shop, which was my preferred spot for these types of transactions. It always felt like a safe, neutral place to complete the sale. As I walked into the coffee shop, I couldn't help feel a sense of excitement. I had a deep connection with that camera, and I wanted it to find a new owner who would appreciate it as much as I had. The bell on the door chimed as I entered, and I scanned the room for Mark. He was already there, sitting at a corner table, sipping on a cappuccino. Mark looked to be in his mid-40s with a well-kept appearance and a friendly smile. We exchanged pleasantries and discussed the camera. It was evident that he was knowledgeable about photography, which was reassuring. I handed him the camera, and he examined it carefully, nodding in approval. I was about to suggest that we finalize the deal when Mark's demeanor shifted. His friendly smile faded into a stern expression. He looked at me and said, "You know, this camera is not in as good a condition as you claimed in your listing. I think I should pay half of the agreed-upon price." I was taken aback by the sudden change in attitude. I had described the camera honestly in my listing and showed it to him in person. It was in excellent condition for its age, and I had no reason to accept such a low offer. I calmly explained that the price we'd agreed upon was already a fair deal, considering that the camera was vintage and it was functional. Mark's response was far from what I expected. He became increasingly aggressive in his bargaining, claiming that he had seen similar cameras in better condition for much less. He raised his voice and argued that I was trying to take advantage of him. Other patrons in the coffee shop began to notice our exchange, and I felt uncomfortable under their gaze. Despite my best efforts to reason with him, he was unrelenting. He continued to press for a lower price, making threats about tarnishing my reputation as a seller on Facebook Marketplace. I was growing increasingly uncomfortable and felt a creeping sense of dread. I realized I was dealing with someone who had a very different agenda than a simple purchase. Seeing that our negotiation had reached an impasse, I decided to end the transaction. I firmly and calmly told Mark that I couldn't accept his offer and that I would keep the camera. His reaction was chilling. He stood up abruptly, knocking his chair backward, and leaned in uncomfortably close to me. "You are making a big mistake," he hissed, his voice dripping with anger. "I know where you live, and I can make things very difficult for you." I was shaken, to say the least. Mark's menacing words sent a shiver down my spine. I had to exit the coffee shop quickly. I left the camera behind, walking away. I couldn't help but looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see Mark following me. I felt a mix of fear, anger, and confusion about what had just transpired. It was so chilling and reminded me that there was more to the internet than simple transactions. With this encounter, I learned the importance of setting clear boundaries and having a safety plan in place when conducting face-to-face transactions with buyers from online platforms like Facebook Marketplace. It was a lesson I would never forget, and it made me more cautious about the people I would interact with in the world of online buying and selling. I had decided to sell my old car online. I posted the ad on a couple of sites, including Facebook Marketplace. I had arranged 2 visits that day, and even though I was home alone, it was broad daylight, so I assumed everything would be okay. The first one came, made an offer lower than what I was looking for, so I said thanks for coming and told him I'd be in touch. One of the Facebook buyers came after. He rolled up in a blacked-out Escalade, and 3 other guys got out as well. I took note of this, but continued on with my sales pitch. I opened the doors of the car and explained why I was selling it. As the man looked over the car, I couldn't help but feel uneasy, as I couldn't understand why 4 people would come to look at an 8-year-old car. He then asked if he could take the car for a test drive. At this point, I was definitely not going to get in the car with him, so I said, "Go ahead, I'll wait here with your friends." He asked me to get in the car. He remarked about what if he just drove off with it. I responded that it wouldn't matter to me. That's what insurance was for. I was definitely not going to get in the car with him. The three guys stood to the side and made conversation among themselves. I wasn't sure if the man would return, and honestly didn't know if I cared. The car wasn't worth putting up a fight over or arguing over. I was still contemplating this when the man eventually pulled back up. He offered me the same amount as the previous guy, and before I even responded, he asked me to get into the car with him so we could go collect the cash. I told him he could go with his friends, but I had another viewing and I would contact him later. I didn't want to walk back to the house just yet, but in my head, I had decided to sell to the previous guy, as this group was totally giving me the creeps. He then told me he'd give me more money than the car was worth if I just went with him. I told him no, and began walking down the street toward my neighbor, who had just come outside with his dog. I shouted hello and made my way towards him. The group of guys got back into the Escalade and drove off after a few minutes of conversation. I texted the other guy back and told him that the car was his and that he could come over any time to get it. Everything seemed to settle down for the night until I saw headlights come through my kitchen window. I pulled the blinds aside just a little and saw the Escalade sitting outside. I called out to my wife to stay upstairs, but she was a little hard of hearing sometimes, so of course, she came down. My phone began blowing up with messages. We both looked at them. They were from the guy in the Escalade. I tried to explain that the car had been sold to somebody else and there was nothing else to talk about. The car drove off, only to come back 30 minutes later. This happened about 3 times that night, but nothing else happened, so I just kind of shrugged it off. 4 days later, though, I finished up work and made my way home. I got my dog's leash and got ready to take him out. We walked to the end of our street with a slight pep in our step. That's when the Escalade rolled up. One of the guys from before got out and said hello. I didn't respond. He then asked if he could pet my dog, to which I replied, "No, you cannot. It is a guard dog and he doesn't like being touched." He then grabbed my arm and squeezed. My dog went crazy, latching onto his arm as he was holding me. The man shouted out loudly. One of the other guys got out of the car and began shouting as well. I finally got him to heel as a few of the neighbors came out of their houses. The guys got back in and quickly drove away. I haven't seen the car since. I decided, then and there, that I would never sell another item that required meeting someone at my home. This story took place a few years ago. I was on Facebook Marketplace searching for a record player. I had been looking for one for a very long time, and I finally came across one at an incredibly low price. It seemed like the perfect opportunity. The seller, who used the username John, had a profile with a lot of positive reviews and appeared to be a reputable seller. I reached out to John, and we quickly agreed to meet at a public location during the daytime to complete the transaction. The location we chose was a busy shopping center with plenty of people around. I felt safe about the meeting. On the day of, I arrived at the shopping center a few minutes early and parked my car. I sent John a message to let him know I was there and asked him to describe what he was wearing so I could identify him easier. He replied, saying he was wearing a blue jacket and a black hat. I spotted a man fitting his description, and he waved me over. As I approached, something about his demeanor struck me as odd. He was overly friendly, he was constantly smiling, and something about his eyes, they just seemed shifty. Still though, I guess I just assumed it was nervousness or social awkwardness. As we discussed the transaction, he mentioned that he had the record player in his car and suggested that we go there to complete the exchange. I knew something was not right. I was hesitant and I insisted on conducting the deal in the public area. He seemed eager to comply at first, but then he suddenly suggested that we move to a quieter, less crowded part of the parking lot for better privacy. My intuition kicked in, and I began to feel uneasy. Instead of agreeing, I firmly told John that we would stay in the well-lit and crowded area to complete the transaction. His demeanor shifted, and he became more insistent. He even tried to grab my arm. Terrified, I managed to break free from his grip and quickly made my way to the nearest group of people. John, realizing that his sinister intentions had been exposed, fled the scene. I reported the incident to the local authorities, providing them with all the information I had about John, including his Facebook account. The police took my statement and warned me to be cautious in future online transactions. This encounter left me shaken but unharmed. It did, though, serve as a stark reminder of the importance of prioritizing safety during online transactions and trusting instincts when something doesn't feel right. My quick thinking and refusal to leave the public area may have saved me from a potentially dangerous situation, highlighting the importance of staying vigilant while using platforms like Facebook Marketplace.